everybody. Today we are making pasta primavera. Primavera just means spring in French, and pasta, so basically we're making a spring pasta. And I'm not actually following a recipe for this. This is one of those things that you can really just go with whatever you've got in your crisper. Part of the inspiration for this today was this beautiful asparagus that we picked. And then also the flowering stalks of some collards. It took me a minute. Collards that were overwintered, amazing overwintering given the weather that we had, and are now starting to go to flower because they produce seeds on their second year. And these are edible. It's a lot like broccolini. They call it broccoli rabe or broccoli or rapini, collard rapini in if you're looking for that online. And so we're just going to take advantage of that since it was going to flower, and that's going to go into our pasta too. We're also going to have a little carrot, a little onion, some tomato sauce, and depending on the recipe that you refer to, some pasta primaveras will have tomatoes, some will not. I always feel a little guilty putting it in because clearly tomatoes are not a spring vegetable because they're not going to be ready in terms of fresh until August. But this is tomato sauce that I canned from a couple of years ago that I have in my pantry, and so I figure we might as well use that as well. But you can do a cream sauce or just an olive oil sauce with some cheese, or you can choose to put some tomato in your pasta. You could also use cherry tomatoes if you wanted to keep it more fresh. So that's what we're up to. These carrots are from Hayshaker Farm, and they were picked last fall, and so they've managed to overwinter. And they're still beautiful and sweet and tasty. And so it's a good excuse to put one of these in the pasta as well. When you're cutting up carrots, it's not a bad idea to cut them in half first so they don't roll around on the cutting board. It makes it much easier to cut them without accidentally cutting yourself. And then in this particular recipe, I'm going to go with kind of a matchstick. So I want them to be a little more on the fine side instead of rounds. But again, whatever you feel like is totally fine. The beauty of this recipe is there's really no right or wrong answer. It's just whatever you have and whatever sounds good and whatever is fresh from your garden. So this asparagus I originally planted when we were living up in Spokane on a piece of property up there. And they were in the ground for about a year up there. And then we moved down here to Walla Walla. And I was determined to not let all of that asparagus go to waste up there. And so we dug it up and we moved it down here. And replanted it down here. And my husband, who's very creative, helped me plant it. And we ended up doing this very clever S-shaped asparagus bed with strawberries intermixed in the parts that weren't the letter of the S. And over time, the gophers have slowly eaten most of what was out there. And so now I have 5 or 6 10-year-old asparagus plants that are quite large and nothing else when I started out with probably close to 50. So the gophers won that round. And then the strawberries that I had out there, I kept going for a long time, and I wasn't doing a good job of managing the bed and thinning it out. I was just kind of letting the runners root. And we ended up with a big old massive bed of strawberries, and each individual berry was about the size of my finger, despite adding a lot of fertilization over the years with manure and things like that, because they just, basically there were way, way, way too many plants for the amount of ground. And so I've actually kind of given up on the strawberry bed as well. And this year, I turned that area into some raised bed gardening instead. So, you know, it's okay with your garden to rethink things over time if something's not working for you anymore. And that's what I ended up doing. So this onion, this is a half an onion that I had in the fridge. trying to decide how much onion do I want in this recipe. Probably not a huge amount, so I'm probably going to use about half of this. It's totally personal preference. And again, kind of mimicking the shape of those carrots, I'm going to go a little bit more with a long skinny onion rather than a dice on this today, just because that's the flavor I'm kind of looking for. Notice how I didn't cut the end of that root off right away? That helps hold everything together so that when you're slicing, your onion doesn't just slide all over the place. That is one of the best tricks there is for onions. I'm keeping a lot of this separate because these vegetables are going to cook at different times. And so I don't want to just throw everything into the pan at once. I want to be able to get a nice little browning on these onions and the carrots, and then start throwing other things in that are going to cook faster, or that I don't want them to overcrowd the pan. A little bit of fresh garlic. This is from the store. I just used up the last of my store-bought garlic the other day and processed it into frozen roasted garlic, call them garlic bombs. And I could easily use that in this recipe, and that would work as well, but I'm thinking that I want a little more of a fresh garlic flavor. There's a little schmutz on this clove of garlic. We're just gonna cut that part off. There's nothing wrong with that a little trimming won't fix. I am loath to throw anything out. I really hate wasting food, and so I often will just cut off the bad parts of things rather than toss the whole thing. All right, so we've got that prepped. This collard has already been rinsed. And everything on collards, broccoli, cauliflower, a couple of other things that are escaping me at the moment. They're all related to each other. They're basically the same plant that's just been selected over time for different things. So everything on this is edible. Everything on a collard is edible. Everything on a broccoli is edible. You could eat the leaves if you wanted to. However, they don't always taste super good. They tend to be kind of woody. I'm checking these to see if they taste woody or if they feel woody. And they're not. They're nice and tender. But if this was woody on the end, this is the very top. That's probably going to be a little bit woody. That's very sweet and nice. But I can just leave the leaves in here. It's not going to hurt a thing. A little extra nutrition. Do you guys eat collards? For years and years, I wasn't a collard eater. And then I just, in the last couple of years, have started to use them. The only way I knew to cook collards was collard greens, where you put them in a bowl with a ham hock and you cook them until they're just dissolved. There's nothing left. And so you cook them for hours and hours. And that just seemed like not really my taste. And then I recently realized they've kind of become in vogue again. And I realized, oh, you don't really have to do that. You can cook them like you do any green. You just cut that middle stalk out on the leaves, and then they're just like any other green. So fresh asparagus, this is going to be pretty tender because I just picked it and it's early in the season, but they can get a little woody at the end. And so the old trick that you see a lot advisory is to just, you kind of give it a snap and it'll break where the woody part ends. You don't have to do this, and if they're all the same size, you can kind of snap one and then decide that that's a good spot, and then trim them all to that length if you wanted to. But this is, I don't know, I kind of get a kick out of it. It's kind of fun, so I go ahead and do it. These have also been rinsed, and you notice I was storing that in a glass of water. That's one of the best ways to store asparagus, and you'll sometimes see it that way in the grocery store if it's local as well. Fresh asparagus does better when it stays hydrated. I'm just going to kind of cut these on the bias, which means at a diagonal, so that they have kind of a pretty shape. Nothing really fancy here. These are going to cook up really fast because they're nice and tender. I also like our favorite way to eat asparagus, and this is probably true of most people, is just on the grill. It is so good, just with a little olive oil and salt and pepper, and you throw it on the grill until it's just starting to get a little bit browned in spots, so that it's still got a little bit of crispness, and it's super yummy. So that's how we eat most of our asparagus, but it's good in pasta too. I've also just sauteed it and put it into an omelet. So you can do lots of things with asparagus this time of year. All right, so that's it. That's our prep done. Okay, time to cook. I am going to use a little olive oil to start with. Let that pan preheat until it starts to shimmer. Got some water boiling for my pasta. This is 4 ounces of spaghetti. You could use any pasta you wanted. It could be a noodle, it could be something like bow tie, really whatever you like. My husband hates long strands of pasta, so I've gotten into the habit in 24 years of marriage to always break them in half. This water has some salt in it. You definitely want to salt your pasta water or your pasta will taste bland. And most pasta, to cook it to al dente, is about 8 minutes, but you get more experience as you cook more of it. I start with a minute or so less than what the package directions call for, and then adjust accordingly as you learn that particular variety. So we'll give that another stir in a minute here. It seems like we're getting there. I'm going to start with the onions. And the carrots. Those are going to take the longest to cook. It's always a good idea to add a good pinch of salt when you're sauteing stuff. It helps draw out the moisture from your vegetables, and it seasons them. And this whole dish is going to come together in the time it takes that pasta to cook, give or take a minute or two. So even with the chopping, you're really looking at maybe 20 minutes to getting dinner on the table. It's a pretty fast meal. Looks good. I got out some frozen peas to add to this, which is kind of a traditional thing to throw in, a nice spring pea. I have a terrible time growing peas for some reason, and so these unfortunately are not from the garden. I don't know if it's our climate here, if our soil doesn't warm up fast enough. I've tried planting peas as early as the middle of March. I've tried planting them as late as the end of April, and I get very slow germination, and then they succumb to funguses in the soil, and so I just usually only get a handful, if that. Give this a stir, make sure nothing's sticking. I have to admit, I am a gas cooking girl. I've only had one electric stove in the past 20 years, and we put propane tanks and piped propane into the house in 3 different places because I really hate cooking with electric. And that brief period where I had an electric stove was a great reminder of why I hate electric. I really like the immediacy of gas, although I hear that induction ranges are awesome. So I would consider looking at one if I ever can't have gas again. There's a lot of controversy around gas stoves and air pollution, indoor air pollution, because of the combustion. But for me, I don't have anybody in the family with asthma. It seems like a worthy trade-off. I'll let those sit for just a minute just to try to get a little more browning because I like that flavor. I could have put more oil in this pan. I probably put about a tablespoon. I'm not a huge fan of really heavy oils and butters. I'm 56, and calories are definitely something I have to take into consideration. So while I love the flavor of lots of butter, I also don't love what it does to my waistline. And so I try to walk that happy medium between a reasonable amount of oil for flavor and browning, but not so much that it's just like you'd get in a restaurant where it's just swimming. Could probably turn that down just a little bit. All right, that's looking pretty good. Onions are getting soft. Carrots are getting a little bit of browning. That's kind of what we want. So this is the asparagus and also the rapini from the collards. And one of the things you can do in this situation is just add a splash of water. And that will boil off quickly, but it helps create a little bit of steam, which helps soften everything up pretty fast. That looks awesome. And really, I just want this asparagus to be heated through and kind of tender crisp. I really don't want it to be super soft, so. Oh, I forgot the garlic. Let's put the garlic in there. I am a fan of the garlic press. I find hand chopping garlic to be pretty fiddly, and I'm not really a fan of fiddly. And so I really do love a garlic press. The trick with garlic is it cooks very quickly, and so you want to like get it into the pan and let it cook for just 30 seconds or so before you start stirring it into everything else, or it will burn. All right, so that's 1 clove of garlic. I might just put a tiny bit of oil in there just to help it saute, and so it doesn't stick to the bottom of the pan. What I don't want it to do is clump up. You guys need smell-o-vision. That smells amazing. All right, let's stir that in. All right. Woohoo! All right, now I'm going to add about half of this jar of sauce. This is a pint. I really don't want this to be like a marinara where it's a lot of tomato. So I'm going to just put enough to kind of moisten everything. Thinking of it as a flavoring rather than a tomato-based dish. This also creates steam, which will help finish cooking that asparagus. If that cooks down too fast, we can always turn the heat down or add a little bit of moisture. What I'm probably going to do is add a little bit of the cooking liquid from the pasta, because that starch helps make a nice sauce. Where is that? Okay. I like to taste a noodle. Those look good and done. I don't know if you can see that on camera, but there's a tiny little core in the center of this piece of pasta that's still white. That's what al dente means. Al dente in Italian means to the tooth. It means it's still just a tiny bit chewy. And that is actually exactly what I want. All right, I'm gonna save a little bit of that cooking liquid with all that starch in there to use to thin out our sauce, and we'll drain our pasta. Excuse my messy sink. All right, yeah, that's starting to, pan's getting a little bit dry. There are people that will tell you you shouldn't cook tomato sauce in cast iron because of the acid. I've never really found it to be a big issue. The worry is that it's going to take the seasoning off the pan. And if you have a well-seasoned pan, it's really not any different than using a little bit of soap when you wash it. It's not going to take the seasoning off the pan. So that's another kind of urban myth around cast iron, is that you shouldn't ever put soap in it. You know, if I'm making a spicy chili in cast iron and then the next morning I'm going to make a Dutch baby pancake, I really don't want my Dutch baby to taste like chili. So I'm going to use a little soap when I clean that out. And that's okay. But again, as long as you keep seasoning it well and take care of it, it's not going to be an issue. All right, and honestly, I think we're about done. That looks awesome. Oh, peas. Let's throw our peas in there. And then the latest cooking craze on the internet, on things like TikTok, is adding feta as a pasta cheese. And I did that kind of classic recipe that went viral last summer of cherry tomatoes and feta, and it was quite good. So I'm going to throw a little feta in here, because why not? I have it. And this should just kind of melt and get creamy with that pasta or with that tomato sauce. Again, fairly conservative, not adding an entire block of feta. Just some nice salty, cheesy flavor. I've turned the heat off at this point, so things are just, oh, no, not quite off. Things are just gonna melt. And if there's still a few chunks in there, I'm okay with that too. Okay. Let's take our pasta. My hands are clean. Evenly distribute that. The other thing I kind of forgot is a nice shake of Italian seasoning. This is actually seasoning I make from my own herbs from the garden. So it's oregano and marjoram and a little bit of thyme and lots of basil. This is a little red pepper flake. We tend to like things with a little bit of spice. That's also from the garden. I grow chilies every year and use them in all kinds of things, including red pepper. The other thing you could add to this, if you had it and you wanted it, would be just a splash of wine. A little bit of acid in here is not a bad thing, and it adds a nice flavor. I'm not going to bother with that tonight, but okay. I think that's looking pretty good. Yeah, that's tasty. A little bit of kick from that acid, or from that chili pepper. And the point of this is really, it's what you want it to be. You don't have to make this recipe. You can make whatever you've got growing in your garden in the spring. You can add tomato, you can leave the tomato out. You can use shallots instead of onion. You can use different kinds of onion. This skillet is really heavy, so it's hard to dish things out of one-handed. So I'm just gonna take that last little bit, see if I can not drop it on the floor. Here we go. Okay. A little bit of fresh ground black pepper. And a little bit of Parmesan. With all the supply chain issues, this has been the type of Parmesan I've been able to find lately. It's not usually the brand I usually buy, but it seems to be fine. And there you go, dinner for two. If you were making this for a much bigger family, you would just add a lot more vegetables and have a bigger skillet. So there you go, pasta primavera from the homestead.